Top 10 reason we know the New Testament authors told the truth. Notes from the 11th chapter of the book titled, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Dr. Frank Turek and Norm Geisler. 1. Embarrassing details are included. The principle of embarrassment suggests that details embarrassing to the author are likely true, as people usually omit what makes them look bad. If you were inventing a false religion, would you portray yourself as a dim-witted, uncaring, rebuked, doubting coward? No way. But that is exactly what the writers of the New Testament did. The disciples are shown to be dim-witted. The disciples often fail to understand what Jesus is saying. See Mark 9:32, Luke 18:34, and John 12:16. Uncaring, the disciples fall asleep twice when Jesus asks them to pray the night he is taken. They fail to give him a proper burial out of fear. Instead, a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, the same court that sentenced him, buries him. Rebuked, Peter is called Satan by Jesus, Mark 8:33. Paul corrects Peter on a theological and sinful issue, Galatians 2:11. Keep in mind that Peter is one of the pillars of the early church, and Paul is honest about the sin for all to see. Cowards, all the disciples but one hide when Jesus goes to die on the cross. Peter denies Jesus 3 times, Matthew 26:33. While the brave men are hiding, the women discover the empty tomb of Jesus. If they were making up a false religion, they would have likely made themselves out to look like heroes. Doubters, despite being taught that Jesus would rise from the dead, John 2:18, 3:14, Matthew 12:39, 17:9, 22-23, the disciples are doubtful when they hear of his resurrection. Some even doubt when they see him risen, Matthew 28:17. 2. The New Testament writers abandon long-held sacred beliefs and practices, adopted new ones, and did not deny their testimony under persecution or threat of death. The New Testament writers didn't just claim that Jesus performed miracles and rose from the dead. They backed it up with radical actions. Virtually overnight, they abandoned sacred Jewish beliefs. Animal sacrifice was replaced with Christ's sacrifice. The law of Moses lost its authority because of Jesus' sinless life. They worshiped Jesus as God, an act considered blasphemy and punishable by death. Instead of expecting a conquering Messiah, they proclaimed a sacrificial one. Not only were the New Testament writers converted, but thousands of Jerusalem Jews, including Pharisees and priests, followed Christ. History shows that within 5 weeks of Jesus' death and resurrection, over 10,000 Jews converted to Christianity, an unexplainable shift unless the resurrection truly happened. These converts also adopted radical new practices: Sunday worship, baptism, and communion, all centered on Christ's sacrifice. Why would the New Testament authors make up lies that would ultimately get them persecuted, excommunicated, tortured, imprisoned, and possibly killed? They could have saved themselves by admitting it was a hoax, but they never did. Church history tells us that all of the disciples were persecuted and or murdered for their faith. Why would any sane person die for a known lie? All 12 apostles claimed to be eyewitnesses to the resurrection. They knew for certain if it was true or not. Their unwavering faith, even unto death, proves their conviction. They staked their lives on the reality of Jesus' resurrection. Third, enemies of Christianity. Confirm the New Testament. Josephus, a Jewish historian for the Roman government, writes in AD 94, At this time there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have reported wonders. And the tribe of the Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day. Josephus, Antiquities, 2200, Meyer translation. Josephus also writes, Then James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, was stoned to death by the Sanhedrin, Jews, in the absence of the Roman governor. Josephus, Antiquities, 20.9.1. Would you be willing to die for your brother if he claimed to be the sinless Son of God and Savior of the world? James was willing to die in the name of Christ because he saw that Jesus lived a blameless life and he witnessed his resurrection from the dead. Next, the Talmud. It is a Jewish history book written by the Jewish authorities between AD 70 and 200 that confirms when, how, and why the Jews killed Jesus. Sanhedrin 43. A states, on the eve of Passover, Yeshu, Jesus, was hanged because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. This tells us Jesus was killed on Passover, had supernatural powers, and he called people to follow him. Fourth, New Testament writers left in demanding sayings of Jesus. If the New Testament writers were making up a story, they should have made up a story that made life a little easier on them. For example, the New Testament claims Jesus said, "Anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Matthew 5:28. Do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Matthew 5:39. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, just to name a few. These are not commands the New Testament writers would impose on themselves because no mere human can live up to the standards set. Only a perfect person could live according to the standards set in the New Testament, and maybe that is the point. 5. The NT writers carefully distinguished Jesus' words from their own quotation marks did not exist in first century Greek, but NT writers very clearly distinguished Jesus' words from their own. Virtually all red-letter editions of the Bible attribute all of the same words to Jesus. This is important evidence towards the credibility of the NT writers because it would have been easy for them to solve theological disputes by just adding to the sayings of Jesus. It would have been easy to make up quotes in relation to circumcision, obeying the law of Moses, speaking in tongues, and women in the church in order to end all debates. Why were the NT writers so careful about distinguishing their own words from the words of Jesus, unless they were telling the truth? 6. The NT writers included events related to the resurrection that they would not have invented. Example 1, the burial of Jesus. Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish ruling council that sentenced Jesus to die for blasphemy. Followers of Jesus were very bitter towards Jewish authorities, so why would they put a member of the Sanhedrin in a favorable light if the story was made up? Furthermore, if Jesus really wasn't buried by Joseph of Arimathea, this detail could have easily have been exposed, making Luke out to be a liar and his gospel a fake. Example 2. The first witnesses. All 4 Gospels say women were the first witnesses to the empty tomb and the resurrected Jesus. In that day, women were not seen as credible witnesses and were not even allowed to testify in court. One of those women was Mary Magdalene, who Luke admits, 8:2, was once demon-possessed. These are not the kind of witnesses that would be made up if the NT writers were trying to fool the world. Example 3. The conversion of priests. Why didn't the risen Jesus appear to the Pharisees? Maybe they were too proud and it wasn't necessary. But it is often overlooked that a large number of priests became obedient to the faith, Acts 6:7. This was written in Luke's letter to Theophilus, Book of Acts. This detail must have been true because this is a detail that could have easily been exposed as false if it were indeed false. And fourth, the alternative explanation about Jesus' resurrection by the Jewish leadership, as detailed in Matthew 28:11-15, was that the disciples stole the body of Jesus and claimed he rose from the dead. This is a ridiculous alternative story because why would the cowardly disciples steal the body and create a story about the resurrection, all in order to get themselves beaten, tortured, and martyred for a lie? If it were true, how did the disciples get past the elite Roman guards who were trained to guard the tomb with their lives? The Jews said the guards were sleeping when the disciples silently moved the 2-ton stone from the grave. If the guards were sleeping, how would they know that the disciples stole the body? Furthermore, no Roman guard would admit to sleeping on the job because he would be killed for the offense. Maybe the biblical story in Matthew is true. The Pharisees created this false story, paid off the guards, and promised to keep them out of trouble. 7. The New Testament writers include more than 30 historically confirmed people in their writings. The New Testament could not have been invented because it contains too many historically confirmed characters. The New Testament writers would have blown their credibility with their audiences by implicating real people in a fictional story, especially people of great notoriety and power. The writers would not have gotten away with publicly telling lies about Pilate, Caiaphas, Festus, Felix, and the entire Herodian bloodline. 8. The New Testament writers include divergent details. The 4 gospel accounts are not exactly the same. Critics say this proves it is a lie, but actually, it strengthens the case for the biblical story of Christ. All 4 gospels tell the same main storyline: virgin birth, miracle worker, Son of God, raised from the dead. But each account includes divergent details. Think of it like this. If a judge hears 4 stories that are exactly the same word for word, he would probably assume that the witnesses got together beforehand to make their stories agree. Collusion. The gospel accounts differ on small details like how many angels were in the tomb, or one account says an angel spoke and another account did not mention it. Just because one account mentions one angel does not mean there were not more. Maybe one was just more prominent. The New Testament shows the nature of eyewitness testimony. I challenge you to read 2 news articles about the same event. It will usually be the same main storyline with some differing minor details. 9. New Testament writers challenge their readers to check out verifiable facts, even about miracles. In Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, he declares that he previously performed miracles for them. Paul was speaking of his own qualifications as an apostle, someone who speaks for God. Paul told the Corinthians, "The things that mark an apostle, signs, wonders, and miracles, were done among you with great perseverance." 2 Corinthians 12:12. Paul would not have written this unless he had really done miracles for them. Why would he have asked the Corinthians to remember miracles that he did not perform, thus destroying his credibility? The only explanation is that Paul was an apostle of God. He confirmed it by performing miracles, and he openly displayed this to the Corinthians. 10th, New Testament writers describe miracles. Like other historical events, simple and unembellished, embellished and extravagant details are strong signs that a historical account may be fraudulent. For example, 100 years after the resurrection of Jesus, a forgery known as the Gospel of Peter was written in an extravagant manner. The Gospel of Peter speaks of long heads that reached up to heaven and a cross that walked and talked at the time of Jesus' resurrection. In the 4 resurrection accounts found in the Bible, there are no extravagant or embellished stories, just bland facts about the greatest miracle in history. If the Gospels were fake, and they were trying to convince the skeptics, don't you think that they would have claimed to have actually seen Jesus physically rising from the dead, and maybe have thrown a few extra adjectives in to help? 35 other miracles attributed to Jesus are described as if from reporters, not wild-eyed preachers.